Recently, the entertainment world was shaken by a disturbing story. Perez Hilton, the celebrity blogger and media personality, was hospitalized after live streaming what appeared to be acts of self-harm on social media. When most people hear a story like this, the first reaction is, why would anyone do something like this? Why would someone harm themselves and do it in front of an audience? Hello and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast. Thank you to those of you who have subscribed to my YouTube channel. If you haven't done so already, please do take a moment to do that. I would really appreciate it. What I'd like to do is really use this moment to discuss some of the behaviors we shy away from talking about because they're dark and scary, and they are actually more common than most people realize. So today we'll talk about what the science says about why people self-harm, what the difference is between self-harm and a suicide attempt, and why that difference actually matters, and who's at risk for this type of behavior, and what should you do if it's happening to you or to someone you really care about. So let's talk with how common this is. It's actually more common than most people think. So lifetime prevalence estimates for what we call non-suicidal self-injury. And we'll come back to that term. That's the term we use in the clinical literature for someone who's not actually wanting to die, but they are committing acts of self-harm. Prevalence estimates are around 17 to 23% for adolescents. So that's like 1 in 5 teenagers report having self-harmed in their lifetime. Now, among adults, the estimate is lower, around 5 to 6%, but we're still talking about millions of people. And when you go to clinical settings, like where people are seeking mental health care, those rates run much higher, sometimes exceeding 40%. So what's actually behind this behavior? What is this all about? Clinically, we understand self-harm as serving a certain function or purpose for somebody. And studies have identified 2 different types of purposes. One is reinforcement. It's doing something for them. It's either taking away some negative feeling or it's introducing some other kind of feeling that they're seeking, or a social dimension that drives this kind of behavior. And we'll talk about both of those. So in terms of the reinforcement model, the taking away some kind of emotion that doesn't feel good and replacing it with another kind of sensation of self-harming, that's called negative reinforcement, when you're taking away kind of emotional state or getting out of an emotional state that is uncomfortable. So this is when somebody self-harms to stop some kind of overwhelming feeling. So they could be so overcome with anxiety or panic or depression or hopelessness or despair that doing some act of self-harm in some way distracts them from or interrupts that very unbearable feeling for them and sort of dampens it. Then there's people who are using self-harm to feel something when they're actually feeling very numb. Now, numbness is a feeling that is common in post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. People just cannot feel their emotions, the good emotions, the bad emotions. It's just very blah. That also happens in depression. And sometimes people will harm themselves just to feel something. Now, those are the reinforcement type reasons. The other reasons that people self-harm are social in nature. So one could be to escape a conflict or avoid a demand. A second one, and I think this is the more discussed one in the Hilton case, is using it to communicate distress or to get a responsive support from somebody else. Now, that's the one that people tend to judge the most harshly. So when self-harm seems to be for the purpose of seeking help or gaining support, people tend to call that manipulative or attention seeking, but the research doesn't really support that framing. The communication of an unbearable pain, while this is a very unhealthy way to communicate it, is really a cry for help when a person just doesn't have another way to communicate what it is that they're feeling. And in Hilton's case, we don't know what function his behavior served or what was really happening internally for him in that moment. But these are the possible interpretations from a research standpoint. Either he was trying to manage something that he experienced was emotionally or psychologically unbearable as a set of emotions, or he was seeking help, or potentially some combination of the two. So now I want to talk about the distinction that I flagged earlier, which is self-harm versus a suicide attempt. And that distinction really does matter. So we're talking a non-suicidal self-injury versus a suicide attempt. These are different behaviors with different kinds of motivations. Non-suicidal self-injury is self-harm without the intent to die. And a suicide attempt is where a person's goal or objective is to end their life, even if they feel ambivalent about that or mixed or even a little bit unclear in the moment. These are sort of categorically very different types of behaviors, and they call for different types of treatment and clinical responses. So this is why the inconsistency in how the media has described the Hilton story really matters, because some outlets have used this language of an apparent suicide attempt. Others have talked about a mental health crisis or self-harm. And as of now, there's really no official confirmed classification of what his intent actually was. And though we don't like not knowing, real cases are often genuinely confusing and ambiguous, even to the clinicians who were involved, and definitely to the public who are watching from the outside. I am hoping that this can get clarified so that clinically he can get the right kind of care to keep him and his family safe, especially given the trauma of what his children likely experienced that day as they were home when this occurred, according to news media reports. So who does this? What puts someone at risk? Let's talk about those risk factors. What we know increases someone's likelihood of self-harm or suicidal behavior. The single strongest predictor is a prior history of self-harm or a prior attempt. So once someone has used that coping strategy before, it becomes a little bit more available to them under stress. We don't know if Perez had this risk factor. The one risk factor that we know he did have was depression and anxiety, which raise risk substantially, as well as emotional dysregulation. So that's like difficulty tolerating or managing intense feelings, which shows up across nearly every single study on the topic as one of the most consistent predictors that there is. And the way we know this about Hilton is that in 2024, he posted publicly about feeling really depressed. He said, you can go from anxiety to depression real quick. And I've been depressed, like really depressed. And he said that he had started therapy. So we know that he had that risk factor. Another one, which we don't know whether he had or not, is childhood trauma. So research on early adversity, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect shows a very clear link to non-suicidal self-injury. And studies suggest that a lot of that effect happens because of the inability to regulate emotions effectively. That trauma makes it much harder for people, and that difficulty regulating feelings is what drives the self-harm. Now, peer victimization and bullying also matter. We don't know if this happened to Perez, although there are plenty of reports that he has victimized other people and in terms of his behavior on social media. Kids and teens who experience high levels of peer victimization, loneliness, or friendship stress show higher rates of self-harm than their peers who don't. And of course, isolation and lack of social support also are risk factors. I want to spend a little more time on one that seems to me to be directly relevant to how this story unfolded, which is what we refer to as problem or excessive internet use. So this is sort of like internet addictive behavior, internet addiction. There are a couple of recent studies that point directly to addictive behavior around internet, social media, technology that predicts later suicide attempts and non-suicidal self-injury. So not just suicidal behavior, but any type of self-harm. And what the research suggests is that This is largely happening because of negative emotions, and it's strongest in people who have very little social support, meaning the danger isn't the screens themselves, but it's when their online life sort of crowds out the offline relationships that would otherwise be protective for someone against distress. And so when we connect this back to Perez Hilton's story, what we do know publicly is that his identity and his career have really been built around nearly constant online visibility for decades. And that kind of life where your sense of yourself and your livelihood are tied to an audience is really consistent with the kind of profile that research associates with elevated risk of self-harm. So it's a life organized around an audience, which is not the same thing as a life organized around close relationships. And that's a pattern that's worth understanding because it not only impacts Hilton, but it can impact many of us and people who we care about, and on obviously a smaller scale. So what happens when self-harm becomes public? This story really raises a specific question about what does it mean when self-harm happens in front of an audience live? Studies have shown that most self-injury actually occurs in private. And when it does become visible to other people, that visibility is more often kind of a breakdown of secrecy or an attempt at connection. And so Hilton's situation is actually not very common, and there's not a whole lot of research to go on to understand it. But at the same time, we do know something about what happens when this kind of content becomes public online. So research looking at the most viewed self-injury videos on major video platforms, collectively viewed millions of times, has found that the audience is very mixed. Some people were self-harming themselves who were watching this. Some were in recovery. Some were at risk of harming themselves, and some were just curious. But here's the concerning part. Watching that kind of content carries a real psychological cost and risk for the viewer, even if they never go on to harm themselves. And that's called vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. It's a pretty well documented phenomenon where people who are exposed to traumatic material through media without any direct exposure of their own can develop real trauma responses, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, emotional dysregulation. This is something that clinicians watch for in first responders and journalists who are repeatedly exposed to disturbing footage as part of their jobs. Second, and more impactful, exposure to self-harm and suicide content is one of the best documented risk factors for contagion. So an association between media portrayal of suicide or self-harm and actual suicidal behavior in the population that's exposed to it has been documented. And the more exposure, the more graphic detail, the more explicit description of the method, the greater the risk of sort of copycat type of behaviors. And that risk is really strongest in people who are already vulnerable. So people with their own history of self-harm. And because the evidence here is so well established, there's actually an entire body of public health guidance from the World Health Organization and the International Association for Suicide Prevention on how media should and shouldn't report on suicide and self-harm, specifically to reduce that risk of copycat or contagion. And that's part of why you won't hear me describing specifics on what Hilton live streamed. It's part of why social media platforms promptly remove this kind of content when they find it. So lastly, and most importantly, I want to close with something practical, which is, what do I do if this is me or someone I love? So if this is you, if you're someone who is self-harming, this is not a failure of willpower or character. It's most often a coping strategy, one that is not very effective, but it's one that some people turn to, which means that the path forward isn't just stop it. It's professional support that addresses what the behavior is doing for you and what healthy alternatives you can replace it with so that you don't hurt yourself in the process. There is a specific kind of therapy that is known to be helpful for self-harm behaviors. It's called dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. So that's a really strong place to start to look that up. If you need to talk to someone right now, there's a crisis text line available by texting HOME to 741-741, and 988 is a 24/7 call or text line. There's also safe alternatives and self-injury outreach and support, or SIOS, both specialized specifically in self-injury rather than a more general kind of crisis response. If it's somebody you love who is harming themselves, the single most common mistake backed by the evidence is responding with shock, anger, or punishment. That increases shame and secrecy, and that puts you in a position where you're really not able to help the person. So that ultimately increases risk rather than reducing it. So the guidance is to ask directly and don't soften the question. Are you thinking about suicide? Is a real specific question that's worth asking outright. And studies show time and again that asking it does not plant the seed or the idea, which is something that people often worry about. You don't want to make your support conditional on them stopping. You just want to help get the person to a professional rather than trying to be the source of treatment yourself. And if the intent behind it is confusing, you don't know if the person is harming themselves as a sort of non-suicidal behavior or if they actually want to die, as we've talked about today. This is very common. You just treat it as a more serious kind of scenario until a professional tells you otherwise. So you really want to seek immediate professional help when you know that anybody is doing something to harm themselves. Perez Hilton's situation raises a question a lot of people are asking right now. Why would anyone do something like this? I hope that today you learned something you didn't know about the actual science of self-harm, why people do this, how in some cases it's different from a suicide attempt, what puts people at risk, and what actually helps. I look forward to seeing you next time.